Welcome everybody. I think you're all getting let in by my lovely assistant and behind the scenes. Welcome to today's session. My name's Christy Spire. I'm the Nature Education Team Leader here at Green Adelaide and have the pleasure of bringing you these webinars once a month. It's been a great series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country that we're meeting on. In Ghana, Ngadlu Tampanti, Ngadlu Ghana Yatanga Imparenti, which means that we are meeting on Ghana country, and it's good to acknowledge that. This is the 8th installation of our seminar series for 2025. Can you believe it? September, which we are running to help share the great work that happens right across Adelaide to ensure that it's cooler, greener, wilder, and more climate resilient now and into the future. So as most of you that have been a part of this series would know, this session is being recorded and will be available afterwards on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel. And we know a lot of you sign in to watch and then the day gets away from you. So we hope you can join in for the session at a later date. You're invited, those that are here with us now, to ask questions at any time by putting them into the chat, or there's also a Q&A function now in Teams. And we will answer as many of these as we can at the end of the session. So today's session, as you can see from my slide, is called Going with the Flow, the Nature of South Australia's Seasonal Rivers. And there'll be a 40-minute session and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So today we'll be diving into the fascinating world of South Australia's seasonal rivers, dynamic systems shaped by highly variable flows. These rivers are vital for ecosystems, agriculture and communities, yet they face growing pressures from drought and climate change. So to guide us through this complex and important topic, we're joined by Principal Hydroecologist Dr. Doug Green, or Doug as he prefers, from the Department for Environment and Water. Doug spent his PhD studying water bugs in the Clare Valley before joining the department in 2012 as an aquatic ecologist. So through today's talk, we'll all learn together more about the unique nature of seasonal rivers, the importance of flow regimes, and strategies for sustainable water management. So it's with great pleasure that I hand it over to you, Doug.
All right. Well, thank you, Christy. As noted, my name is Doug Green. I'm the Principal Hydroecologist working in the Water Science Unit of the Department for Environment and Water. And I'm going to be talking you through the nature of South Australia's seasonal rivers. Before we jump into that, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm currently presenting from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. But I'd also like to just take a moment to sort of take a step beyond that and say that through my work, I have had the privilege of working alongside many of the nations of South Australia when it comes to managing water resources, and have learnt huge amounts about these systems from those conversations and from hearing the stories and talking with people out on country. So not only do I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, but I'd also like to acknowledge people from the nations who are actively out there today caring for country. I think they're doing an amazing job, and I feel really privileged to be able to work alongside them. So about me. So I was born in South Africa to two Kiwi parents, but raised in Australia with a brief stint in South America, which means that basically when it comes to the rugby world, the Rugby Tri-Nations, I win every time. I did my undergrads at Flinders University studying biodiversity and conservation, did an honours, and then went on to do a PhD looking at using genetic techniques to map and to understand how water bugs move around the landscape, and particularly in seasonal rivers. And I did this based in the Clare Valley, which, as you can see from the photos there, was a terrible spot to spend afternoons catching water bugs. I started working for the department in 2012, and my work has always focused on how flow and water availability, as well as other environmental drivers, affects the health of South Australia's waterways and water-dependent ecosystems. My role focuses very much outside the River Murray. I don't work on the River Murray. The department has a whole team of hydrologists and ecologists who specialise on the River Murray. So they do the River Murray. Me and my team do the rest of the state. We do cross over a little bit and we do work together, but fundamentally they do the Murray and we do everything from the Mountain Springs in the north to Piccaninny Ponds in the southeast and everything in between. So I said I'm a hydroecologist, and a lot of people can sort of fundamentally understand what that means, but if you break it down, it becomes a little bit more nuanced. So principally you can understand hydro, study of water, ecology, study of ecosystems. So obviously studying the ecology of water, but hydroecology is a little bit more than that. It's looking at the interplay between how systems flow or how systems make water available and how that impacts on the ecology. So, when I asked ChatGPT about what a hydroecologist is, they said hydroecology looks at how the movement, availability, and quality of water influence ecosystems, which is not far off. But essentially, my role centers around looking at water and how that then drives ecosystems and ecosystems condition. I was originally employed as an aquatic ecologist, but I don't consider myself an aquatic ecologist anymore. That's not what I really do. I engage with and I work with aquatic ecologists who provide me all the data on the ecosystem, so fish data, frog data, bug data. But I then take that information, I pair it with flow information to look at how those systems are responding to changes in the flow regime. So this presentation, obviously, we're going to be talking about seasonal rivers. We're going to be talking about flow regimes. We're going to be talking about how those things are changing. So just wanted to throw out that we're not really going to talk about groundwater. We will touch on it in a few instances, but realistically, this is a presentation on flow. So let's talk about flow. There's a couple of definitions that we kind of need to get off straight away. So the first is flow regime. So flow regime, if you ever heard myself or another aquatic ecologist or hydroecologist talk, we'll always talk about the flow regime. And simply put, that's just the way that the river flows over a period. So whether that be over a year, which is how we generally describe it, or it could be over a month or over a decade, but it's just how the river flows over a period. And we generally break that down into things like, does it have a no flow period? Does it have a long low flow period? Does it have high flow periods? We sort of talk about it in those fairly broad general terms to describe how a river flows over the course of a year. If we think about different types of flow regimes, there are three really high level categories that we break rivers down into. The first is a perennial river, so a river that flows all the time. The best example of that is the River Murray. So believe it or not, the River Murray actually does flow, and it flows all day, every day. So it's a perennial river. Then the next one is a seasonal river, or sometimes called an intermittent river. And these are rivers that flow for part of the year following a relatively predictable pattern. So by that, what we mean is they have a cease to flow period and then a flowing period. And those things happen in a relatively predictable process. So the cease to flow period will generally happen over summer, and then the flow period will happen over winter. The final type of river that we have is an ephemeral river. And an ephemeral river is a river that only flows after rainfall events. So the best example we have of these sorts of rivers are the rivers in the Flinders Ranges, where most of the time these rivers are dry, they don't have any water in them at all. And then you'll get a big rainfall event that'll cause these rivers to go from zero to hero very, very quickly. And you'll get these flash floods. They'll move through the system very quickly and then disappear just as quickly. So the idea is that an ephemeral river only flows after rainfall and ceases quite quickly. So as I've sort of said, we're going to talk about the seasonal rivers, and examples of these are everywhere. For those who are sitting in Adelaide, if you can think of a river in South Australia outside the River Murray, you're probably thinking of a seasonal river. So the Torrens River, Onkaparinga River, North Para, South Para, Angus River, Finnis River, Bremer River, all of these are examples of seasonal rivers. So, they are the most common type of watercourse that we have in South Australia. And as I sort of said before, they are defined by having a relatively predictable flow regime. So top left here, I've got a bit of a very stylized flow regime for a seasonal river, just to sort of give you a bit of an idea about what the sort of parts we're talking about are. And looking at this sort of river, so you picture this as a river, we start in January, there's no flow. So in January, the river is completely dry. It's dry through February, dry through March. And then in April, something happens that causes the river to start flowing. Now, this could be, breaking rainfall. So it could be, getting the first rainfall events of a year coming through, which are putting water into the river, creating flow. It could also be the river just starting to flow all by itself. So personally, I think the most fascinating things of seasonal rivers is that they have the ability to start flowing all by themselves. And that happens because over summer, we have really high atmospheric pressure in South Australia. That's just part of our natural process. We have high pressure systems that sit over the state in summer. And what that does is that high pressure pushes groundwater further underground so that, it's deeper, it's disconnected from the surface. Once we start to get into autumn, we start to get some of the low pressure systems coming up from the south. That pressure is released, the underground water rises again. That can actually get to a point where it opens up springs, opens up soaks or seeps in the landscape, which will then put water into these watercourses and they can flow all by themselves. So I think it's really, really cool. One of the most fascinating things is that these rivers will start flowing even in the absence of rainfall. Once you get through April into May, June, that flow is building and building. And then in this particular example, in July, we get a big storm event that comes through. So that causes medium and high flows. That then drops back down. Then through September and October, you're getting consecutive large rainfall events that are pushing the flow into that medium and into the high flow events. Then in November, the rainfall events start to cease. So the water levels drop quite quickly. And then through December, heading into summer again, the evaporation takes over, those high pressure systems come back into the state, pushes all the water back underground, and back into January, the river is now dry again. So that's a stylized version, I guess, of what these things look like. To put that more into perspective of reality, underneath that, so the bottom left, I've got the flow regime of a river in South Australia. So this is the Hutt River up in the Clare Valley for the period 2017 to the end of 2020. And it just illustrates what these flow regimes look like in actual life. So 2017, quite a wet year. So a couple of big storms coming in sort of late winter, early spring. But you can see at the start of the year and at the end of the year, there's no flow. And then again in 2018, starts with no flow, then it has a flowing period in the middle, although much less flow this time, and then back to a zero flow by the end of the year. Then into 2019 being an incredibly dry year. The flow takes a lot longer to start, but again, no flow, flowing period in the middle, cease to flow at the end. And then finally 2020, same pattern again, but a delayed start because it was so dry the year before. Takes a lot longer for the system to wet up. But again, cease to flow period, flowing period, and then cease to flow by the time you get back into summer. So this is that sort of predictable pattern that we're referring to with seasonal rivers. But obviously within that predictable pattern of cease to flow, flow, cease to flow, you've got massive amounts of variability that are inherent in the system, which you can see in that example from the Hutt River. You have really, really wet years, you have really, really dry years, but that process of ceasing to flow, flowing, ceasing to flow maintains. The other critical part about seasonal rivers, which is really, really important when we start to think about the ecology of these rivers, are permanent pools. And permanent pools are exactly what they say on the box. They're pools that remain permanent throughout the course of the year. And they manage to do that because they're fed from groundwater. So they're fed from water coming from up underneath the pool rather than rainfall or stream flow flowing into the pool from above. And these things are critical because that's when, during the cease to flow period, that's where all of the fish and the bugs and the frogs, the things that need to stay in the water or close to the water, go to hang out over summer. So this picture that's here, this is the Hill River, again from Clare, and you can see those dark splodges, they're all permanent pools within the Hill River. They vary dramatically, but they all have generally similar characteristics of they are quite deep. They're all fed from groundwater from underneath. They all have relatively good water quality. They're all relatively clear. They're quite important parts of the landscape. They're not always clustered as closely together as this. They could be kilometers apart from each other, or they could be clustered together like this. It really just depends on the river system. So taking all that sort of hydrology information and simplifying it right down to the core concepts, the annual cycle of a seasonal river follows the following process. It starts out as a pool over summer. Then as we move into autumn and into winter, we get that influx of groundwater coming up from underneath. We have the first rainfall dropping water into the pool directly or potentially causing little bits of flow entering the pool. Eventually the pool fills up and it will start to flow. That flow will then build and build and build so you get the high flow period over winter and into early parts of spring. Then that will all decrease and it'll go back to being a pool system. So this annual cycle happens every year. There are there's variation within what happens between years, but essentially this cycle happens over and over again. And if you remember nothing else from this presentation, the one thing which is absolutely critical is how long the river spends in each phase, i.e. the pooled phase or the flowing phase, is critical for its ecology. The ecology of these systems happens in two very distinct parts. What happens when it's not flowing and what happens when it's flowing. The fact that it has both of these components is what makes it really unique. And that's what drives the difference between these rivers and perennial rivers and these rivers and ephemeral rivers. So this isn't a new concept. This isn't something certainly that I've discovered. This has been around for a long time, and it was captured really, really succinctly in an absolute keystone paper in this sort of field, which was the natural flow regime by Poff and others in 1997. And this paper coined the phrase the natural flow paradigm, which essentially is a fancy way of saying that rivers, or the ecology of rivers, responds directly to the flow regime that they are given. So what that means is that if you have a seasonal river with a very short cease to flow period, it will have a different ecology to a river that has a really long cease to flow period. The ecology responds principally to that flow regime. And they've adapted this concept through time. So there's been a series of papers on this theme that have continued on. But all of them come back to this idea of, and if you've ever heard me present before, or if you hear me talk in the future, you'll hear me talk about flow as the master variable. Flow is always the master variable when it comes to seasonal rivers. So, coming back to that core concept, how long we spend in the dry phase versus the flowing phase is the most important thing. And that's always driven by flow. So think of any of the other traditional influences or problems that you can associate with rivers, like water quality. If you've got too much salt in a seasonal river, what's the solution? Make it flow. If you've got too much nutrient in a seasonal river, what's the solution? Make it flow. If you've got too many carp or gambusia, introduced fish species that don't like flow, what's the solution? Make it flow. So if we can manage the flow regime of these seasonal rivers, then we're a long way down the track of managing all the other drivers, or not all, but most of the other drivers that influence the condition of ecosystems. So if we think about how this actually plays out over the course of a year. So we'll start on the left-hand frame. So we've got a permanent pool. this pool isn't flowing. It's an isolated pool within a watercourse. We've got some fish living in the pool. We've got some water bugs living in the pool. We've got some flying bugs that are hanging around above the pool. And we're going through summer. And as we go through summer, everyone's trapped. The water quality is slowly getting worse. So as summer progresses, water is evaporating out of the pool. Yes, it's been replaced by groundwater from underneath, but you're still getting the concentration of salts and nutrients and other pressures within that water, making it slowly and slowly more inhospitable as the summer goes on. But then we move into autumn, we start to get some of those low pressure systems coming through. So we start to get more groundwater coming in to freshen the pool up. We might start to get the first little trickles of flow moving into the pool. And that's going to be the trigger for fish and bugs and frogs to think, okay, things are about to happen, time to move. So the first thing that's going to happen is our little fish is going to jump from the pool into the flowing habitat. So they're going to move in there for a couple of reasons. The first is it's really crowded in the pool, so they want to get out, reduce the competition that they're facing. Second of all, they're going from a pool to an entire river worth of habitat. So there's much more opportunities for foraging, much more opportunities for hunting, for protection from predators. There's all good things there. They're also going to go out there to breed, so they're looking to find a mate somewhere out there in the wide world. And they're also going to be looking at migrating, so moving around the landscape to see if they can find somewhere else to colonize. So they're going to be out there swimming around in that flowing water. The second thing that's going to happen is the bugs that have been flying around above the pools and above the rivers, they're going to land in that flowing water and they're going to lay their eggs in there. Those eggs will hatch and then the larvae will live and grow in that flowing water environment so that they can take advantage of all the the good water quality, the nutrient availability, all that sort of stuff. The final thing that's going to happen is Mr. Yabby over here is going to do a nice little dance and throw a bit of a celebration because he's got the pool to himself. He's happy. He's got all that space where he's now no longer competing with everyone else. So things are happy. But time marches on and the process has to go back the other way. So when we come to the end of spring, heading into early summer, the situation reverses. So we're going to see the flow through the flowing sections of the rivers start to decrease. And that's going to be the signal for the fish and the bugs and the frogs and all that sort of stuff that the flow season is coming to an end and you need to get back to the permanent water. So as soon as that happens, we're going to see the fish jump straight back into the permanent pool. They're going to do that because if they stick around in the flow too long, they risk getting stranded. And if they get stuck in the flow or they choose the wrong pool that ends up not being permanent, it's game over for the fish. So they need to make sure they get back to the permanent pools. Second thing that's going to happen is all those bugs that have been growing up in that flowing water, they're going to take to the wing and they're going to fly off so they don't get stuck in that drying environment as well. And the third thing that's going to happen is Yabby's going to get super, super angry because now he has to share his home with everyone else. And this is the same pattern that's been going on year after year after year for thousands of years. Yes, we have wet years, we have dry years. Sometimes the flowing period is a lot shorter, sometimes the flowing period is a lot longer. But in general, this is the same process that happens every year. But things are changing. So since colonization, we've had some really drastic changes to the way that the landscape functions in terms of how these rivers operate. So the first major change was the clearance of the landscape. So if you go walking around in a national park or anywhere you've got some good remnant vegetation, what you'll see is that you've got trees, you've got shrubs, you've got leaf litter and wood on the ground, you've got small herbs and forbs and things. All of this acts like a giant sponge. And when it rains, all of that soaks up water and then slowly releases it back to the landscape. So what that means is that in a natural environment, in a vegetated landscape, the way that water translates from rainfall into runoff into the watercourses is a much slower, more gradual, more muted process. Whereas if you've cleared the landscape, all you need to do is saturate the top 5 centimeters of soil before you start to generate really fast runoff. So what happens in a cleared landscape is that top 5 centimeters or so gets saturated, and then water just sheets off the landscape into the rivers very, very quickly. So you end up with more water entering the watercourses much faster, but also in a much flashier way. So it comes in fast and then disappears quite fast as well. It also comes loaded with sediment, it comes loaded with nutrient, you have erosion problems. All of these things have been issues that these seasonal rivers have faced since the landscape was cleared. The second major thing that's changed in the landscape is that if we think back to the stylized flow regime we had at the start, where we said over summer it's dry, no flow, over winter there's lots of flow and lots of water. If we think about that from a farming point of view, it's back to front. We don't need water during winter because it's raining and the rain is doing the job of irrigating our crops and providing water for our livestock. Over summer, when there's no water available, that's when we need water. We need water to then irrigate our pastures. We need water to water our sheep and our cows and that sort of stuff. So the system is fundamentally backward for what we need. So in order to manage that problem, the standard solution is to build dams. And dams do what they do, name on the box. They capture water, they dam the water, and they stop it from flowing downstream so that over summer, the landholder has a nice ready supply of water to then do with what they please, to water their sheep or their cows or to irrigate pasture, whatever they need to do with it. So this all sounds perfectly fine and perfectly logical in terms of meeting a need, but it also comes at quite a significant consequence for ecosystems. So if we take the image here on the left, which is the farm dams at Glenthorne before it became a national park, this is a fairly classic situation that we'd have out in the landscape for a seasonal river. So you've got a seasonal river here, which has, it's got a dam in there. We're over summer, so the water level has decreased quite a lot. Then as we move out of summer into autumn, the rivers will start to flow and they're going to flow into that dam. Now, the dam itself, if that wasn't there, that flow would be moving on past this point of the landscape and heading on down to permanent pools and stuff downstream at this point, triggering all those good things for the fish and the bugs and the frogs. So triggering, migration and breeding events, all that sort of stuff. But because we've got this dam in the way, instead of that water flowing down through the landscape, it's going to flow and get captured by this dam. And it might take a month, it might take 2 months, depending on the size of the dam, for that dam to then fill and then spill. And in this particular instance, there's a second dam immediately downstream, which means we need to wait for that dam to fill and spill before the flow finally moves on down to our fish and our bugs. And that could be delaying flow for 2-3 months. I mean, if the dam's big enough, it can actually entirely block all downstream flow in all but the wettest years. So if you're thinking about this from that key concept of the key thing for ecosystems is how long they spend in the dry phase versus the flowing phase, if you've delayed the onset of flow to that particular permanent pool by 3 months, that's massive. And it makes a really big difference in terms of things like the likelihood of successful breeding of fish, how likely bugs are to be able to get through their entire larval cycle before they take to the wing and move out. Even things like how much terrestrial vegetation is moving into the watercourse because it's dry, so the terrestrial vegetation can occupy that territory. So dams are a really, really big challenge in the landscape. And that's not to vilify, not to demonize dams at all. They are a very, very required and functional part of the landscape, but they are a challenge in terms of how we manage them in order to achieve broader outcomes, including environmental outcomes. And the final thing, which I don't think anyone listening to this talk would be surprised to hear about, is climate change. So climate change, as a general rule, is making it hotter and drier in South Australia. We're getting less rainfall, which less rainfall translates into less runoff, and less runoff translates into less flow through the rivers. So, yeah, we need to just think about that in the context of, what that might mean for these aquatic ecosystems. Then the final part of this is thinking about, okay, well, I was always taught going through university and high school that climate change was a very slow and a very gradual process. It was going to sort of creep up on us ever so slowly. But what we're actually seeing is that this change is now coming at us in ways that we weren't quite expecting in terms of increased variability. And one of the key things that we're seeing at the moment is this snap drought, which started in 2024 and has gone through to 2025. And despite being a relatively short time period, is a massively deep drought, which is having really, really serious impacts on, everything across the board. So we've seen the desal plant fire up so that we can have potable water for Adelaide. We've seen farmers in the Mount Lofty Ranges, having their dams run dry and needing to get source alternative water for drinking. And of course, this also translates to fairly large impacts for the ecosystems as well. In terms of what this actually looks like, this is actually some data. So, we've got across South Australia, the department and the landscape boards monitor hundreds of locations across the state for river flows. So I've just taken 4 sites relatively at random and had a look at, talking about that flowing period, how often the river flows, had a look at that. So what we're looking at here, 4 sites: Baker Gully in the Onkaparinga catchment, which is downstream of Clarendon, the Hill River in Clare Valley, the Marne Gorge, which is in the Marne River, and Penrice in the North Parra, which is in the Barossa. So 4 rivers spread across the state. And what we're looking at is the number of flowing days per year. And I've broken it down into pre-drought, drought, and post-drought. And unsurprisingly, from pre-drought to drought, we see a reduction in the number of flow days. So that tracks, right? It's a drought. We're expecting to see less flow through our rivers. The somewhat surprising thing is that even though the drought has technically broken, we're still seeing a reduction in the number of flowing days per year. So in all systems, here and in the vast majority of systems that we've assessed across the state, this is the pattern that follows. You have, pre-drought, drought, post-drought. And the post-drought generally does not show recovery back to pre-drought conditions. And if we think about flow regimes and how this plays out in the reality for the ecosystems, if you look at Baker's Gully, that used to be perennial. It used to flow virtually all day, every day, up until about the year 2000. Then the drought hit and it started to cease to flow for about 50 days a year on average. And now, post-drought, it ceases to flow for about 100 days per year. It's even more stark when you consider the Marne or the North Parra, where, both the Marne and the North Parra back in the 1970s and early 80s were perennial. They used to flow all day, every day. But now, if you come to 2018, 2019, and 2020, you can see that the Marne actually ceased to flow entirely for 3 years. So, these are some of the really drastic changes that we're seeing in response to all of the combined influences of climate change, land clearance, dam development, watercourse extractions, water use. All this stuff coming together is playing havoc with a lot of these flow regimes. So what happens when things get dry? So I think there's a couple of really critical things to understand when we talk about when these systems are getting drier. And it comes down to, these systems are incredibly adaptable. They are that way by nature. They have to be, because South Australia is an incredibly variable climate. We have really wet periods, we have really dry periods. So thinking about when things get dry, it's what happens when things get so dry that we push these species beyond their adaptable boundaries, if that makes sense. So when it comes to flow and that sort of things, shrinking flow windows generally means that most species will find spots that work for them. So as a general rule, things will contract back to smaller, more palatable locations. So for example, the picture you can see here, this is a site in the Marne River. This is a site that normally is flowing quite well at this time of year, and yet it's green and stagnant and horrible. So all of the things that would normally be living in this part of the river would have boogied off somewhere else. But the real challenge comes when things go really dry. So, you know, what happens when things go dry? The obvious is it gets worse. But as that cease to flow period, as the lack of flows progresses, things can get progressively really, really bad. So we've kind of gone beyond a point for a lot of our river systems where we've pushed through that boundary of, you know, we've got the resilience and resistant boundaries of all our different species. For a lot of things, we've gone past those, and we've seen quite a few species either have their ranges drastically reduced across the Mount Lofty ranges and across South Australia, or having to move to completely different systems. But what we're starting to see as we're moving forward now is something that's a little bit different. So the three pictures here are the same pool. This is in the North Parra and the Barossa. And the first picture was taken in September 2023. And at this stage, the pool isn't totally full. It's very close to being full, but it is an isolated pool. You can see the water's nice and clear, which tells me that this pool has been fed from groundwater. And you can see my colleague standing in the pool, and it's about, at its deepest point, about 1.8 meters deep. Fast forward 12 months, so the middle picture is taken in September 2024. And you can see that over the last, over 2024, there was no flow that came through the system in 2024. So this pool hasn't had a chance to be topped up. It hasn't had a chance to refresh, and it's now gone really stagnant. The fact that it's gone murky tells me that the pool has disconnected from its groundwater source. And what we're seeing now is just the remnants of a permanent pool evaporating away. At this stage, we probably would have lost most of our fish out of this pool, and only the toughest of the tough water bugs will be surviving. The final picture was taken in May 2025, so this year, and as you can see, the pool is now totally gone. So this is a pool that I've been going to every year for the past 13 years, and I've never seen it dry out completely. So this is a warning sign. And I want to stress that this isn't common. This isn't the standard across the landscape. What this is a canary in the coal mine. This is climate change giving us a shot across the bow to say, hey, things are going to change, things are changing, and you need to be ready for it. So thinking about being ready for it, there's, I think the first thing just to throw out there is don't panic. We're not at panic point yet. So, this is what I do for a job. This is my bread and butter. I'm not panicking yet. I'm just sitting here going, okay, so what are we going to do about this? And I think the first thing we got to do is we got to make sure that people don't have their heads in the sand anymore. And I don't think that's a problem. When I started working for the department 13 years ago, climate deniers were fairly common around the place, friends and family, people you meet, through work, landholders. There was a bit of resistance to the idea of climate change. I don't think that's there anymore, and certainly not from a state government perspective. So I don't think we've got our heads in the sand, but we need to make sure that that continues and we face this head on and we face it with open eyes. So in terms of planning for the future, the two things which are critical are evidence-based decision-making and flexible and adaptable management. So evidence-based decision-making is something that I'm hearing more and more in terms of direction and guidance that we're receiving, which is fantastic because it meets with our ideas of how we can best manage systems. But we really need to understand these systems best to be able to provide good advice on how to manage them. And to that effect, we have really good monitoring networks around the state. So, we monitor hundreds of rivers. We've got hundreds of groundwater bores that we monitor. We do fish monitoring. We do bug monitoring. There's a whole heap of monitoring that goes on to provide the best information we can. And we use that to feed into models. We use that to feed into projections. We use that to feed into our conceptual understanding of how all these systems work so that we can start to think about, okay, well, what if we manage it this way? What if we manage it this way? What would happen if we tried this? What would happen if we tried that? The next part of it is taking all that information and using it to develop up an adaptable management framework. So the days of having a plan where you sort of set a 10-year plan, set and forget, are kind of done. We need to really be thinking about this as responsive plans to what the climate is telling us. So if we sort of think about this as a decision tree, if we start on the left-hand side and we say, okay, for this particular resource, was rainfall above or below average this year? It was above average. Excellent. Okay, so we're in the top line. Next decision point. What was the stream flow? Was it above average or below average? Oh, it was below average. Okay, so that means we're in scenario B, which means we need to manage the resource like this. And that's really important because it means that we have the opportunity to really use the resource effectively and manage it sustainably. So when there's plenty of water available, everyone can use it, everyone's happy, the environment's happy, we're all good. When there's less of the resource available, we need to think about how we can sustainably manage that shrinking resource such that we can get through the dry periods with something to come out of the back end. So in thinking about how we work this stuff through and what it looks like moving forward, there's a couple of key things which we need to do, and we do in order to work together to come up with better, more informed management of these seasonal rivers. So the first thing is understanding. We need to understand what people want from these systems. And generally it's quite, I'm fairly confident saying most people want sustainability, but the question is sustainability of what? Are we talking sustainability environmentally, economically, culturally, all of the above? Understanding, unpicking what that looks like for individuals is really, really important because it then allows us to figure out, okay, so what are we aiming to achieve moving forward? And the next step is we need to include people in the decision-making process. So seasonal rivers, water resource management, all that sort of stuff is, it's a tricky thing, but we need to include all the people, bring them into the tent and include them in the decision-making process so that we can achieve buy-in. Because there's no point coming up with a wow, fancy plan if no one buys into it, because then it just ends up as a dusty document on someone's desk, doesn't actually achieve anything. But if we can, bring everyone in, engage everyone, get buy-in from everyone, then that plan actually has a chance of achieving what it sets out to. We need to protect the last little bits of really good habitat that are out there, and they are out there. So across the landscape, there are gems within the landscape that house, good diversity. They house, good fish, good bugs, good vegetation. We need to protect these parts of the landscape so that they can act as a refuge for the future. Because over the future, we know things are going to get harsh. We know we're going to see reductions in species, species distributions contract. So if we can maintain these good little bits of the landscape, these gems, then when things get good, that's providing the opportunity for things to move out and to expand again. So we need to protect these areas from things like water resource development. We need to protect them from vegetation clearance. We need to protect them from invasive species, things like trouts and willows and ash trees. We need to protect these systems from those particular threats. We need to enhance different ecosystems, and you'll notice a very particular choice of word there. It's enhance, not restore. And that comes down to the final point, which is exception. But we need to understand that, we've got to enhance these systems to improve the ecological functioning to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve. Restoration of these systems actually may not be possible at this point. The flow regimes have changed so much that no matter what we do in terms of management of the resource, these systems are going to, they are going to fundamentally change. So enhancing these systems to achieve good outcomes is probably the best bet. And the best example of this for me is what we've seen our colleagues in New Zealand do in terms of their fence off and revegetation program. Fencing off, you exclude the stock, which means you stop the physical damage of the watercourse by the stock. And then revegetating, we get, the plants that provide shade to the watercourse. They provide, different inputs into the watercourse in terms of wood and carbon. They filter the water that comes across the landscape to make sure the water is nice and clean. And they provide habitat for birds and perching insects and that sort of stuff. So they're all good things. So enhancing ecosystems just increases their resilience to potential changes, and that's only going to be a good thing. We need to manage these things better, and in terms of managing, we need to stop thinking about really simple rules like we just need to limit how much water people can use, or we need to cut allocations or whatever. We need to think about this in a more strategic sense. We need to think about this in a more, what can we do to, for lack of a better term, have our cake and eat it too? And the best example I've got of that is the Flows for the Future program with their low flow bypasses in the Eastern Mount Lofty Ranges. So in the bottom right, there's a picture there of a dam. As water comes in from the left-hand side of the screen, it hits a structure, which is what you can see in the image to the left of it. So water hits that structure, it drops down into the grate, and then enters a pipe to go around the dam and then carry on downstream. So that water can continue on, it'll find the permanent pool, and it can do all the things that flow is meant to do in terms of start triggering migration, breeding, water quality improvements, all of that stuff. But once the water coming into that inlet structure is greater than the pipe can handle, then the water will just flow straight over the top and into the dam. So that by the end of winter, the pool downstream has got water, it's happy, it's done all the things it needs to do, but also the dam is full. So the landholder has a full dam to move forward over winter. I think the final thing is that we need to accept, and I'm sort of just moving on to this because if we accept that things are going to change, then we need to start thinking about, okay, so what does the future look like? And I can see from where I sit in terms of the work which I do, there are huge opportunities here in terms of managing these systems better into the future so that we have, an environment that is healthy, it's functional, it's diverse as it can be. We have lots of opportunities there. We just need to be brave enough to take them. That's not to say this isn't without challenge. Water resource management in general, and particularly for seasonal rivers, is challenging because there is competition for water. We live in the driest state and the driest inhabited continent on Earth. So water resources are scarce and people will be challenged for them. We do have some wins on the board already. The Flows for the Future program has installed over 450 devices on dams and watercourse extractions in the Eastern Mount Lofty Ranges. And that's all been done voluntarily. There's no mandate for that to happen. It's a voluntary program, and 450 dams have come on board and said, yes, I'm keen to do my bit to help improve the flow regimes, but also not have the terrible impacts on myself that other options could do. The other thing, the other example of that is in terms of the enhancing ecosystems, looking at Breakout Creek and the lower river torrents. The work that's been done there to take that system, which is a completely novel ecosystem. Breakout Creek is a man-made system. To take it from where it was 2 decades ago to what it is today, applying all of the different bits of understanding that we have of watercourses and ecosystems to improve that system, has led to an incredible outcome, which is an amazing place to go and look at now. And I think the final thing I'd just say is seasonal rivers are, in my opinion, one of the most pristine, beautiful places that you can spend some time in the landscape. This particular photo here, this is the Onkaparinga River in the Onkaparinga National Park, where Bakers Gully Road crosses the river. It's stunning. So I think if people can spend some time in these systems just to get to know them, you'll appreciate them. If you appreciate them, then you start to value them. And once people value things, then we can look at, okay, well, how can we work together in order to, maintain these things? How can we look to keep these things going into the future? So that's me done.
Beautiful, beautiful ending and picture. I love it down there in Coringa. So great example, and yeah, really fantastic to hear about the flows, program and people volunteering to be a part of valuing and setting up things in the river system as well. There's so much that people can contribute to as well. So we've got a few questions for you. I think some of them have been answered as we go along a little bit as well, and lots of little rounds of applause and so forth. So thanks for your presentation. So one from Kerry here about just a question around how many of our seasonal rivers were permanent prior to water resource development, and the example of the Finnis River she gives.
It's a really, really good question. The answer is that we don't really know.
Yes.
It's one of those things that unfortunately people weren't really paying that much attention to how rivers were flowing before landscapes were cleared and before water resource development happened. The best that we've got and what we play with in modeling situations is what we call the no dams scenario. So we build a model of the catchment, which we base on the current flow regime. We calibrate that to all of our flow gauges that are spaced throughout the landscape, so we can build the best model we possibly can. And then we go through and we turn all the dams off. So we essentially make all the dam storages to be zero, and then rerun the model to see how the river would flow if, in theory, we went and removed all the dams. And what we see in that particular situation is there are many places in the landscape that rivers shift from being seasonal to being perennial, but it's localized. So what I mean by that is you won't get, the Finnis is a great example where the whole of the Finnis will not go perennial, but you'll get sections of it that will. And that's to do with the way that groundwater and surface water interact over the length of a watercourse. So where surface water and groundwater interact more closely, when we turn the dams off, those sections will turn perennial, versus sections where the groundwater is a little bit further deeper underground, then we see those sections maintaining that seasonal signature. So in terms of, total length of watercourse that's shifted from one to the other, we don't really know. We still know there are examples of perennial stretches of watercourses out there in the landscape, and those are the critical refuge habitat that I was talking about protecting. Those places are really critical to protect, because that's where we find all of our really flow dependent sensitive taxa, which has kind of been lost from the rest of the landscape. So unfortunately I can't really answer the question exactly, but yes, there has been quite a transition from more stretches being perennial to less stretches being perennial. But I don't think we really had any truly perennial full watercourses, with the exception, I will say, of the Tukiota River in the Eastern Mount Lofty Ranges, which is fed from a very, very unique Permian sands aquifer. So that does maintain flow year round, but that's a unicorn in the landscape.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, fantastic. Couple more here. Let me just see, a few more were coming through. I might go back to this one a little bit. I think you covered off on a few examples of this, but so that might have helped Geraldine there. But in terms of what are the key fields of activity and actions we can change to help the system to recover faster and avoid some ongoing damage or irreversible damage. Yeah, so I think you've outlined a few of those, but and also there's a chat in here about that your your perspective around that some of it is only about enhancing now. We're not going to be able to completely restore and go back to what once was.
Yeah, so it's in terms of understanding what we can do to increase the resilience of these systems. The key thing, I'll keep going back to it, is flow. We need to ensure that the river has as good a flowing period as it possibly can. But outside of that, then there are other things. There are other drivers that influence the condition of aquatic ecosystems. So thinking about things, the example I gave from New Zealand of fencing off and revegetating, and there certainly are examples of that from South Australia as well. Probably not as universally uptaken as it has been in New Zealand, but providing that protection for the watercourse from direct sunlight and from stock impacts, from nutrient inputs from the landscape, all these different things just help relieve bits of pressure on it. So if you picture, the ecosystems and the rivers are under constant stress from multiple different angles. So the more things that we can relieve that stress from, the more tolerant it's going to be from pressures coming from elsewhere. So it's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. If we can take a few other straws off, then we can add one or two more on, hopefully without breaking it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so how from Brenton, I guess we can apply most of these watercourse principles to wetland ecosystems as well.
Yes.
Do you have any
absolutely.
experience in that? Yeah.
So the fundamental difference between rivers and wetlands is obviously wetlands are a static system where you've just got water that rises and falls depending on where if it's coming up from a river or whether it's coming up from underground, groundwater versus surface water dependent wetlands. But yeah, so with the wetland system, instead of talking about how often the river is flowing, you're talking about how often it's inundated and how deep it's inundated are the two variables that we talk about for wetland systems. So obviously it's not a case of longer or deeper is better, because if you push things too far in a wet direction or push things too deep, then you can actually start to drown plants or you can change vegetation structures. So it's actually about understanding what the needs of the system are and trying to maintain those. Because if you start to shift things away from what they historically have been, then you're naturally going to start shifting the vegetation structure away from what it's naturally been.
That's right. Yeah, become very unique. Yeah, and also we've only got a few more minutes, but a question or a not so much question, but could you talk a little bit about enviroflows from reservoirs?
Yes, great question. So so we spoke about dams in the context of dams are generally things in the landscape that will fill and spill. So they delay flow coming down the stream, but they don't totally block it. Reservoirs, on the other hand, they are a complete fundamental block to these ecosystems, to downstream ecosystems, downstream flow. The reservoirs are designed to capture everything except for the really, really big floods. So in order to manage ecosystems downstream of these things, the reservoirs release water, and they go through a process where we look at what are the ecosystems downstream, what are their flow requirements, so how often do they want water, how often do they need water, what sort of boundaries do we have to play in. And then the next question is looking at how much water is in the reservoirs themselves and saying, okay, how much water do we have to play with there? Because obviously anything to do with reservoirs comes with impacts to critical human water needs. So we very much need to balance these two things against each other to make sure that we're not jeopardizing Adelaide's metropolitan water supply. But the current eFlows program has been designed and operating for a couple of years now, and it's based on an understanding of what's downstream, what their flow requirements are, and then trying to release water downstream to replicate as close as we can what those needs are. It's challenged by the fact that, you know, at the moment we're in a really, really dry period. So there's less water flowing into the reservoirs. So, you know, SA Water do have the ability to, you know, under the current management, they have the ability to say our reservoirs are too low. We're a little bit freaked out about water security. We're not going to release any environmental water, which is a real challenge because that's actually when the environment needs it most of all. So, you know, we work really closely with SA Water to try and navigate those things, to try and figure out what options we have in terms of making sure these critical water needs are met, even if it's not fully met, even if we can't meet the entirety of what those ecosystems need, even if it's just a little bit, just to keep them ticking over. So just to make sure those permanent pools don't go stagnant and don't start to, you know, go really nasty. So even if it's just a little, you know, 10 litres a second trickle through these river systems that normally would be expecting hundreds of litres a second, even if it's just a little trickle through the system, it just keeps the system fresh, keeps it topped up, which means that it's not going to completely implode over summer, so that hopefully next winter it's better. You know, and then, you know, what happens next winter when it's not great and the following one, that's a bigger question. But yeah, the environmental flows program downstream of the reservoirs is absolutely critical to maintaining these ecosystems downstream, because without it, you know, the Onkaparinga River downstream of Clarendon, Torrens River downstream of, you know, Kangaroo Creek, the South Power River downstream of the South Power Reservoir, without it, those reaches would have no water at all. So it's absolutely critical that, you know, we keep working, you know, the Landscape Boards, Department of Water and SA Water work together to maintain that program and to figure out what is the best way to push that into the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Great to, really understand the importance of those types of programs and, making sure that people in the community understand that as well. So unfortunately, we have hit time and I haven't gotten to everyone's questions today. So thank you so much to everyone that has sent through a few more questions, and some of them were big questions as well. But we will collate these questions and send them through to Doug and get some details back to those of you that we didn't get to today. So obviously everyone is very engaged in this discussion and how we can think about it and plan for the future as well. So thanks everybody for joining in, but we do like to keep this nice and tight to the hour. So thank you so much, especially to Doug for his time today and for everyone that joined online. We'll send a follow-up email with all those links and ways that you can dig deeper into this and promote this fabulous research and all the programs to your networks and friends and family. You'll also receive an invitation to our next webinar in this series as well, which has got another water river theme. So please join us for that, bringing it back, the transformation of the river Torrens, fish flows and habitat. So that'll be a great one on Wednesday, the 8th of October, which will come up very soon. So lots of thanks coming through in the chat there, Doug, for your time today. And I'm glad that it's been really interesting and informative for everybody. Hope you all have a great night and we keep getting these, the nice wet spring. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.